Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, wow, the sound is high. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I guess we can sit in the order.
You should go next to the clicker.
Yeah, be fine.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this very important discussion on information integrity on climate change, a discussion that is at somehow the crossroads of different issues. Information integrity, of course, climate change, of course, but also, and this is why we're here today in Oslo, internet governance and how the internet has reshaped our information ecosystems and what we can do about it to preserve access to reliable information on an issue, a crucial issue that is climate change. Information integrity and climate disinformation, you will see this through the presentation of our panelists today, is a very important topic, and it really, and we'll have some evidence from researchers and colleagues, it really delays our ability to tackle climate change, and to us at the Forum on Information and Democracy, it is also a democratic issue. It is a democratic issue when climate disinformation is weaponized for political purposes and political gains. It is a democratic issue when journalists who are investigating climate change, environmental issues are targeted, are threatened, and in the worst case, are murdered. And it is a democratic issue when access to information, to facts, to knowledge is undermined, and we can clearly see today that and a lot of knowledge institutions are being targeted for doing their work. And this is why at the Forum on Information and Democracy, we launched a dedicated work stream with the signatory states of the Partnership for Information and Democracy on ensuring information integrity on climate change and other environmental issues. This work stream is co-led by Brazil and Armenia, as Brazil will host, as a lot of you may know, COP30 in November, and as Armenia will host COP17 on biodiversity next year. The reason we launched this work stream is because we want to ensure that the answers that will be brought to this specific challenge also respect democratic principles including transparency of powers, plurality of information, access to reliable information, and something that is really dear to our heart, the political and ideological neutrality of the information and communication space and the entities that structure this information space. Because I have the privilege of being the first one to talk, I will just stress on one specific point that is related to information integrity. The fact that to have information integrity, we need people and institutions that provide reliable, independent, trustworthy information. And I would like to stress the importance of environmental journalists and the media that are doing this work of investigating climate change and environmental issues. And to us, we need to ensure that they can do their job freely and safely, that we have access to their facts and to their findings through social networks and throughout the information ecosystems, and that their work is also sustainable, and we're doing a lot of work on media sustainability these days. So thanks a lot. I would like to thank again all our panelists today. We'll have a very important presentation on different efforts that are being done, notably the global initiative for information integrity on climate change that is led by actually the three first panelists, Brazil, the UN, and UNESCO. And I would just like to start with you, Eugenio Garcia, the Director of the Department for Science, Technology, and Intellectual Property at the Brazil Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If you could start by presenting Brazil's leadership in the global initiative and how the idea emerged, and what are the challenges that the initiative aims to address, and why is such a priority for Brazil? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I think for Brazil, it's clear that the climate crisis is real, it's urgent, and not something for tomorrow. And in Brazil, we have been severely affected by extreme weather events. For example, in 2023, the drought in the Amazon rainforest was possibly the worst in history. and also the flooding in the south of Brazil last year, 2024, of course, was a tragedy with many people displaced. But this is to show that these extreme weather events, they are affecting the life of people in a very direct way, because it's not something that we think of global warming as something that's not felt by people on the ground. And we have last year the G20, the Brazilian presidency of the G20, and we thought that would be in terms of testing the waters to see if we could include information integrity in the program, in the agenda of the, specifically the digital economy working group. We had 4 priorities for this working group. One was universal and meaningful connectivity. The second, infrastructure, digital public infrastructure. Then the third, artificial intelligence and the governance of AI. And the 4th priority that we presented to the G20 members was precisely information integrity. When we didn't know exactly the reaction or the feedback we would get from this discussion, but in the end, we reached a consensus, and it was positive because it was the first time that the G20 addressed the information integrity. And we had a ministerial meeting in the city of Maceió. It's in the northwest of Brazil, when you find these 4 priorities, including information integrity. For those interested, you can download the Maceió Declaration. Just go make a search, and it's available in English for you to read later, and how this topic was addressed by G20. Then, in the meantime, we have been discussing with the United Nations Secretariat in New York, in particular the Department of Global Communications, and UNESCO, in terms of joining forces, and also all the stakeholders. But the idea was to launch the global initiative on information integrity and climate change during the summit of the G20 in November 2024 in Rio de Janeiro. And that's what we did in partnership with the UN and the UNESCO. And I think for not only the Brazilian government, but this is a top priority for, and we pledged for the Global Fund. I think Guilherme will explain later the details of how the Global Fund is structured for this global initiative, but we pledged $1 million. That is, let's say, it's adding to what we say that's important, but also showing that our commitment is really something that we mean as something extremely important. So I think in terms of coordinating efforts and talking to other stakeholders in different international organizations or different forums, for example, G77, now we have COP30 coming in Belém do Pará. It's next November, as we know, and it's a huge responsibility. So we want to create this global movement so that you have information integrity, there's a growing awareness of the importance of addressing this issue in terms of how we address climate change challenges, and in terms of bringing this topic everywhere. Let's say the Global Digital Compact also mentioned information integrity. It's interesting to highlight this because it was adopted by the UN in 2024, and UN member states committed to work together to promote information integrity, tolerance, and respect in the digital space, and strengthen international cooperation to address the challenge of mis/disinformation, hate speech online. And by the way, also in the elements paper of the co-facilitators for the WISES +20 process, they also mention information integrity highlighting that stakeholders should promote information integrity tolerance in respecting the digital space. This is dialogue with the GDC and protecting the integrity of democratic processes, strengthen international cooperation, and also trying to mitigate the risks of information manipulation in a manner consistent with international law. So I think this is part of a global effort with our partners. And in terms of engaging with COP30, I think that's now we are trying to focus our action in terms of reaching November with some concrete initiatives. So you know that the president of COP30, Ambassador André Correia do Lago, in his first letter, he mentioned the idea of the call to action that it's a mutirão. Mutirão is a Portuguese word from the indigenous communities in Brazil. The idea of having a collective endeavor, so that in the village, everybody would help each other in the spirit of coming together to deliver results. So the village would, each one would bring something, sometimes bring tools or materials or even skills, no? to reach this collective endeavor. That's the idea of mutirão. So we are now planning for the global initiative on information integrity on climate change, call to action. Of course, I think my colleagues will also address some of the initiatives that are ongoing. For example, we have a meeting in Bonn. I think Charlotte will talk about this, trying to integrate the global initiative and the action for climate empowerment. But this call to action that we will be launching soon it's trying to integrate this agenda with the COP30. And the goals, I think it would be useful to highlight some of them, because these are joint efforts to contribute to this, what we hope this is a global movement with very concrete actions to promote information integrity, such as gathering and sharing data, rigorous research, evidence and knowledge on risks to climate information integrity, including disinformation and impacts on climate action in line with the GDC. Also sharing practical tools, methods and materials to strengthen resilience against disinformation and promote information integrity on climate change. Developing communications campaigns, strategies and efforts designed to raise public awareness and foster a global culture of information integrity, including through trusted voices and influencers. These are the goals of this call to action. Fostering media sustainability, including its economic viability to cover environmental and climate change related issues. Supporting the protection of environmental journalists, activists, communicators and scientists. Protecting scientific data and data sets related to climate change. Promote transparency and accountability in digital advertising to help address financial incentives for climate disinformation and foster climate information integrity. Fostering target media information and digital literacy related to climate change, and also donating financial resources to UNESCO's Global Fund to help to gather evidence and strategic communications, including in professional journalism. To conclude, I think this call to action, that is the next step in the global initiative related to COP30, will contribute to including information integrity on climate change in the COP30 process by uniting efforts across borders and sectors and representing a pivotal step towards a global movement, as I said, for promoting information integrity on climate change. So I will stop here. But I think that's the idea, not what we are trying to achieve.
And this call to action will be open to all stakeholders, civil
Open
society,
to all stakeholders. So we'll soon launch this and have the details, and we'll have a period that we'll be assessing the contributions that we expect to receive, and we are optimists that we have received many proposals.
So that's the first call to action on the road to COP30. And I think that one thing that I find really remarkable with the work that Brazil is doing is bridging community together, different communities.
Yeah.
And the community working in journalism, on internet governance, and now on climate change. And I think bringing this community to our topics of information integrity is also very, very valuable. And I'm sure that the UN is also quite well placed to do this kind of work. So Charlotte Scadden is the senior advisor on, if you could put on the slides, please, for Charlotte, who is a senior advisor on information integrity at the United Nations Department of Global Communication. And before you start, happy birthday, Charlotte, because today is it's not Charlotte's birthday, sorry. It's the first anniversary of the Global Principles on Information Integrity that were published exactly 1 year ago this day.
I thought you were going even to tell her age.
No, I would not. Sorry. So, Charlotte, could you tell us a little bit more about the UN role in strengthening climate information integrity globally, with a focus on policy, public diplomacy, and communications, of course, anchored in the UN Global Principles for Information Integrity?
I will, and thank you, Camille, for mentioning the anniversary, which of course I'm going to touch on. And frankly, to me, it's actually more important than my own birthday, with the amount of effort that we put into developing the global principles. But so I'll just start by giving some context. As you all know, the UN has, I'm sure you're very familiar with our work on climate change, and it's a huge priority for us, climate action. But more recently, information integrity has also become a major priority. And of course, there's a range of initiatives going on around the UN related to information integrity, but I wanted to touch on two today. And one, of course, is the Global Principles for Information Integrity that, as you mentioned, were launched a year ago today by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And the principles, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, are, I think, a groundbreaking framework for action for a safer, more inclusive information ecosystem. And we put forward 5 of these principles, recommendations for different stakeholders around 5 principles. And you see them on the screen here. They are societal trust and resilience, healthy incentives, public empowerment, independent, free, and pluralistic media, and last but not least, transparency and research. So the principles frame information integrity as an information ecosystem where freedom of expression is fully enjoyed, and where accurate, reliable information, free from discrimination and hate, is available to all in an open, inclusive, safe, secure information environment. And this entails a pluralistic information space that fosters trust, knowledge, and individual choice for all. So actually, in the past year since we launched, the response has been really overwhelming. And we've seen government, civil society, media, businesses, and other really harness these principles through activities and efforts around the world. So we go into work on information integrity and to implement the global principles with our eyes wide open. Because the challenge before us is formidable, and the threat landscape is vast. Risks include mis and disinformation. I think everyone's generally familiar with those, as well as hate speech and harassment. But we also see other risks that are more structural or political. So suppression of independent news media, and suppression of academic and civil society work and voices, denying of access to information, the defunding or removal of public sources of information, and of course, top of mind now, are risks related to emerging technologies, including Gen AI. Because we see tech companies continue to integrate AI into our everyday applications at breakneck speed. They are not slowing down, as we know. People are now increasingly reliant on this tech to shape their understanding of the world and everything that's happening in it. But while Gen AI tools are proliferating in the public domain, They can't uniformly be relied on for accurate information. And we see ongoing tests and studies that show that these tools frequently do not distinguish between rigorous science on the one hand and dirty data or outright nonsense on the other. And yet, people are accessing this flawed data, but they're not equipped to assess its veracity or reliability, which can contribute to what we see as a deeply concerning trend, and that is the lack of trust in any information source and in the information ecosystem more broadly. People just don't know what's real, what to believe. We are, in effect, guinea pigs in an information experiment in which the resilience of our societies is being put to the test. So in short, the spectrum of risks is broad, and it goes way beyond just the false information itself. The issues impacted are also wide-ranging, and it really touches on all areas of the UN's work and what we need for a sustainable future and functioning democracies. When it comes to climate, the motivations and impacts are twofold. Purveyors of climate disinformation and hate obviously seek to undermine climate action, right? And we've seen the fossil fuel industry and others, including state actors, pour billions into this over decades. But we also see climate change used as a wedge issue to polarize, to disrupt, to destabilize democratic processes, particularly around elections. And we always will see a spike around pivotal societal moments. We know enough to be able to make these conclusions, but the evidence base ranges. And while there's some strong research from major academic institutions and civil society organizations, including IPIE, as we'll hear shortly, much of this research is concentrated in a handful of countries where the support and funding have been focused up to now. And as many of us here know really well, this support has been under attack and politicized, especially in recent months, with researchers, civil society, and others targeted. So that's why our focus on research is really key. From our own limited research efforts, we've identified a range of tactics used in attempts to undermine climate-related information. The narratives used as part of these tactics, which you see a list here of a sample of them, and I'll just mention a few. They range from there being no scientific consensus around climate, to climate change is a manufactured political tool and a scapegoat for domestic policy issues and failures, to globalist elites using climate issues as a means of justifying totalitarian policies, and even to control the weather. And sometimes when I say that last one about controlling the weather, I get kind of sniggers. But in fact, this is actually coming from leading political figures. And these claims are used to kind of steadily erode trust in academic, scientific institutions, in the UN, in COP and the COP process, and also to isolate people to certain information sources, which are often very localized. And what we've seen is that underlying a lot of these tactics is what we call the us versus them, the constructed enemy adversarial stance. It's painting those who support climate action as elites serving only their own interests. And these behaviors are not in the fringe. They're in the mainstream of information spaces, and they're being used by influential figures, both state and non-state actors. So what can we do? Well, as laid out in the global principles, first and foremost, we need multi-stakeholder action. And it's a very UN term, I think, but it's really a valid one. Obviously, and this brings me to the next example, a really leading example of this is our global initiative that we just heard about, and it's really a major priority for us at the UN as we approach COP. Our response has to be multifaceted and include prevention and mitigation measures across the information ecosystem. This includes strategic communications and advocacy, of course, political engagement, human rights-based policy, and community engagement. We need to recalibrate our previous thinking about the information ecosystem and the information landscape so that we better understand people's relationship to information sources today, which is often playing out in very niche spaces and at the community level. What many institutions have long thought, and I include the UN in that, have long thought as mainstream media is no longer mainstream. The mainstream has shifted, and that's true across many geographies. We need to immediately identify and fill information voids, because if we don't fill them, the disinformation actors will, and they'll do it quickly and without hesitation. And we need to think longer term about building trust and how we can keep attention by carefully considering our tone and language around climate issues, and going about engaging communities with humility and respect so that we avoid reinforcing that us versus them trap. When it comes to structural obstacles, what has become really crystal clear to us is that we need to expand and engage our circle of stakeholders. And that includes the advertisers who fund the digital ecosystem and as such have unique power. They can act quickly and effectively to mitigate harms and influence digital platforms in ways that we cannot. And that's why just a few days ago, I was with colleagues from organizations represented here on stage at Cannes Lion, which is the biggest and most important annual gathering of the ad industry. And we took our message of information integrity to that key audience. And I'm really happy that Harriet is here to explain the advertising angle in more detail. It's somewhere where it's an angle that we're really going to be focusing on a lot in coming months. So I'll just end by saying, you know, we don't have time to spare. I mean, the urgency and the scale of this challenge require active coalitions and collaborations so that we can increase global resilience, and we need to find those entry points for action before it's too late. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I think the one thing I take from the presentation is really to have this sort of broad approach, gathering all the stakeholders, including advertisers. I'm sure we'll get back to that in a moment. Guilherme from UNESCO. Guilherme Canela is the director of the Division for Digital Inclusion and Policies and Digital Transformation. You've been also a leader in that space and also working a lot on freedom and safety of journalists. We're really glad to have you on stage and to have you talk a little bit, complementing what has already been said on the global initiative, maybe more specifically around the UNESCO's approach on this and about the fund that has been mentioned already, and also the work that UNESCO is doing with interconnected issues, notably on safety of journalists, for example.
Thank you, Camille. A pleasure to be here with all these fantastic colleagues in the panel. Let me start by telling you a story. 20 years ago, when I was not an international bureaucrat and I was doing intelligent things in my life, I coordinated an initiative about climate change and journalism and the media. And it's interesting to look 20 years back, this was for Latin America, on what were our mistakes on that time, because we didn't notice, and this was a huge mistake, that we couldn't face the issue looking into just one of the actors. So we lose what the bad actors already knew at that time, the ecosystem logic of this. So the initiative, that one that I did 20 years ago, was very successful in its goals. Our initiative was to train journalists to speak, to cover better climate change. But when we were talking with them, or even with the scientists, the logic is the scientists want to know how to give better interviews for the journalists. The scientists were not even thinking that there was an important field of research on the issue of information integrity, to use an anachronical word, because we didn't have that expression at that time. So what we were betting our horses is that if we train the information producers, at the time the journalists, we will solve the problem. And this was a huge mistake of our part, because we were not prepared enough to think the rest of the ecosystem. So the initiative here, and what Charlotte was describing in terms of the information integrity concept, is very much related to this broader idea that information is a public good. And then in UNESCO, we simplified that with 3 pillars, right? If we consider information as a public good, we need to empower the citizens to interact with the ecosystem, right? It's education, it's media and information literacy, so on and so forth. But this is a necessary condition, but it's not a necessary and sufficient condition, because it's unfair to say to my uncle or to my grandmother, well, don't circulate this thing you received in the WhatsApp or whatever, knowing that on the other side of the fence you have trillion-dollar companies, either fossil fuel companies or companies that are relying a lot on this attention economy. So it's unfair to put only on the shoulders of the society to solve the problem, but it's necessary. So this is qualifying the demand. The other pillar is that we need to qualify the supply. So 20 years ago, when I was doing those intelligent things, we thought that qualifying of the supply was to support the journalists. But that was wrong. We need to support the scientists. We need to support the influencers. We need to support the advertisers, all those that are sending inputs to the system, and to guarantee that this support is enough for them to do this in a reliable and accurate manner, but also they need to survive. Advertisers are doing quite well, but the journalists are not, or the scientists. So we need also to deal with the economic issue, but also with the safety issue. 20 years ago, the journalists were telling us, well, there is an issue here and there, but no one was saying, I'm being attacked because I'm covering climate change. Now we hear that all the time, and it's not only attacked online, which is already a big issue, they are being attacked physically. They are being attacked with massive slaps everywhere. So there is also a complexity here in protecting the supply side of the story. But again, it's a necessary condition, but is no longer a necessary and sufficient condition. So the third part of the story is what Charlotte was explaining, how we deal with the transmission chain, right? With the ecosystem that includes the social media companies, the governance, now the AI and whatever. So it's not one thing or the other, it's one thing and the other. And that's why it's so complex. So the initiative wants to look into this, recognizing this complexity, but telling, look, there is one particular element here that is a gap, and it's a gap particularly in the Global South, as I guess you are going to speak about your recent findings. That's, yes, we have anecdotal evidence that there is disinformation out there. Lots of people are debunking this disinformation. But we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, right? Who is funding this disinformation? What are the systems of distribution? What are the conflicts of interest that are there? What are the lack of governance mechanisms? And then the fund that we launched, there is an open call for those interests, Global Initiative on Information Integrity, open call, you will find it. You can apply until July the 6th, closing the propaganda element. The idea is precisely how we can collect more evidence to support our work in strategic communications in UN and UNESCO and others, the work of foreign information and democracy and advocacy, and the work of governments on governance, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's the idea. And basically, we are going to fund research and investigative journalism in these areas. To conclude a bit and coming back to my initial story of 20 years ago, when I was training those many journalists in Latin America and discussing climate change, for not a second in any of those hundreds of trainings I did, or with my team, we were including in the conversation of the journalists the need for them, and today for others, to understand information integrity as part of the problem. They were only looking into the climate change component. And this, it's not working. We need to look into this connection between those two words. And for me, this is a bit of the beauty of this. And also, it's already a positive message. Because not only us, when I say Brazil, UN, and UNESCO, there is, and as Eugenio mentioned, the elements paper of the WISES is including information integrity. The Global Digital Compact did. So in that sense, I think there is room for optimism, because there is a concern, and this concern is raising different elements across the board. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guilherme. So supply, demand, and distribution. And as we've seen on and on, more access, better access to data, to have a better understanding of what's actually happening out there and in these really opaque information ecosystems. Let me now turn to Harriet, and I think we have some slides again, if we can have them. Harriet Kingabi, co-chair of the Conscious Advertising Network, and also representing today CAD, which is a Climate Action Against Disinformation. And as already mentioned, with you will, and it's a very interesting presentation, take a deep dive into ad-funded risks to climate information integrity. So the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome today. So for those of you that don't know, the Conscious Advertising Network is a broad coalition of over 190 brands, advertising agencies, and civil society groups. We exist to essentially ensure effective advertising works for everybody, and happily I can say that we are a very practical application of the multi-stakeholder approach that I've heard a lot about at this conference. What we essentially do is we know that advertising is causing human rights issues. We know that civil society has the deep knowledge there. We know that advertisers understand the advertising ecosystem extremely well, and so we bring those groups together to try and look for solutions. Essentially, as Charlotte said, we've just come back from the Cannes Festival of Advertising, and although the language that is used is very different, although the way the issues are presented is very different, I can assure you that the issues of information integrity were discussed there incredibly passionately, and almost as passionately as I've seen them discussed here. I have to say, business is framing them in terms of the business case, and I want to unpack that a little bit for you today. But I want to just start out by addressing the elephant in the room, which is that obviously advertisers are, on one side of things, part of the problem. This is a quote from the IPCC report, Climate Change Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, that talks about the vested, political, organised and financed misinformation and contrarian climate change communication, which is undermining information integrity around climate change. Now, yes, the advertising industry itself is producing some of that disinformation. It working with clients, such as fossil fuel clients, that are part of the problem. However, I want to just tell you that this is only a part of the way that advertising interacts with information integrity. And I hope that I can convince you that advertisers can also be a part of the solution today. So, this is a hideous graphic, but I think it illustrates the attention economy quite well. Advertising is essentially the funding model behind the attention economy, and therefore the reason that addiction is designed into the system. Advertising funds the media, it funds the platforms, it funds our more traditional media ecosystem. And online, the longer we can be kept scrolling, the longer our attention can be kept, the more ads can be served to us, and therefore the more profit the platforms can make. And what this has done is this has completely changed the incentive structures behind the production and distribution of content. So quality used to be pretty high up on the agenda, informing citizens, entertaining citizens. But in fact, now the emphasis on content production is about keeping us hooked, sucking us in and keeping us hooked, essentially. And this is creating unhealthy incentives for the production of content that has devastating consequences for information integrity around really important issues such as climate change. Most of this you know. I think there's been plenty of cleverer people than me talking about that at this conference. But the twist that I want you to take away is that this situation does not work for advertisers either. And that actually creates opportunities for us to create powerful alliances that can really, really take on some of this system. So let me explain, if I can get the clicker to work. Essentially, this is too small for you to read maybe, but what you need to know is that the global advertising market is enormous. We're talking $1 trillion as of this year, and it's growing. And in particular, the digital component of this system is growing. Now, what this means is the problems that we're talking about today are being amplified and accelerated. And therefore, they are becoming really business critical for advertisers to understand and to tackle. Much as democracy relies on a sense of shared reality, on trust, advertising also relies on trust. So where you have a fall in trust in our information ecosystems, advertising also starts to become less effective. So what this means is businesses are paying more for less return on their advertising spend. Falling trust in information essentially is a shared problem that we're both looking at. Now, at the heart of this problem is the fact that the advertising ecosystem is so incredibly opaque. If you think about how we consume media now, the my journey through the media ecosystem will be completely different to Guillermo's today, will be different to Charlotte's, will be different to all of yours. And the technology required to track me around my personalized media journey and to serve me ads is enormous. There are many actors in this system, many technology companies that do things like collect my data, process that data, work out what ads to serve me, kind of do online auctions to make sure I see the ads that I'm supposed to see. And unlike other corporate supply chains, unlike the supply chain to make this shirt, for example, advertisers have no idea where their advertising is going and what it is funding. There's no know your customer law. There's no mapping of those supply chains. And so what happens is people take advantage. So one side of things is fraud. There's a lot of fraud in the system. The other side of things is that the platforms are taking large amounts of money. And this is coming at the cost of publishers. So we've heard about the fall in advertising revenue to publishers and the impact that's having on the news system. We heard about news deserts this morning. And there was a report that found that out of every dollar that an advertiser spends and puts into this system, only 41 cents of it actually reaches the publishers. And that used to be much, much more. So the rest of it is swallowed up by organizations like Google and, frankly, organizations we've never heard of. And all of this compounds the problem. If you've got less reporting on important topics, you're degrading information integrity, you've got less trust. So this is fueling the production and distribution of climate disinformation. It's tempting to think that that businesses can be opposed to climate action, and sometimes this is true, but there are vast categories of businesses that need us to solve the climate crisis in order to survive. Think about the businesses that make coffee and chocolate or wine. Think about the insurance industry, for example. And essentially, advertisers alone don't have the tools to solve this problem. They need to work with us, everyone here, in order to make that happen. So I want to show you what I mean, the issues that this system is causing. So writing on this is small. For those of you who can't see it, the advertiser, it's a screen grab from YouTube. So the advertiser here is called Money Supermarket. They help UK consumers to get quotes from their insurance companies. So they work a lot with insurance companies. And they are advertising on disinformation that suggests that Hurricane Helene, which went through the US, is somehow linked to the US government controlling the weather. Now, as Charlotte mentioned, this kind of disinformation creates distrust in the institutions that are supposed to help us when extreme weather events happen. But it also, it's pretty bad for the insurance industry because it slows efforts to sort out the problem. Here is YouTube advertising on its own channels against content spreading disinformation about the cleanup efforts from the Valencian floods that killed hundreds of people, and who the cleanup efforts were kind of undermined by climate disinformation. Now, this has wiped percentage points off the Spanish GDP. This situation is not good for business. It is not good for us, but it is not good for them either. And here is Get Your Guide on Oeste, a Brazilian channel with nearly 3 million followers, promoting a narrative which was used during the 2023 Rio Grande do Sul disaster as a way to discredit government cleanup efforts. Again, this slowed efforts to help. This is still earning money 2 years later. The reason that I draw your attention to this is not content that is organic. This is content that is earning money for its creators. So I've singled out YouTube here, but I can find you examples on TikTok and other channels of this, and I can find you examples of creators earning money from this. Nobody wants this system to continue. Not us, not you, not advertisers, because essentially not only are they wasting their money, but they're also putting their brands at reputational risk. So together, we need to address this. Not one single actor has the power to sort this out, but we do need to start moving conversations on with the platforms away from content, away from individual pieces of content and whack-a-mole, to talking about systems change and the business model. So and the UN Global Principles on Information Integrity are a fantastic way of doing that, of looking at that through this systemic lens. So I'm going to wrap up, I promise. Final slide. The things that I want to talk about today are about essentially taking on the information economy. In order to engage advertisers in this situation, we need to be talking about the system which is drawing people in order to serve them more ads, and therefore prioritizing content which is divisive or untrue. Next, we need to drive transparency through this incredibly opaque system at scale. And I'll talk more later on about a case study we have of how that can lead to great business outcomes as well as outcomes for society. And also, once they get a handle on their supply chain, they can start to think about investing in pluralistic media and news. So, to summarize, this is good for business and it's good for us. So working together in these multi-stakeholder approaches can only bring us better solutions.
Thank you so much for this deep dive into the economics of disinformation. Much to do indeed with all the different related stakeholders. You mentioned that democracy, we need a sense shared of reality, and that makes a nice transition to our next guest, Frederic Ogenga. Frederic, you are a member of the IPIE, the International Panel on the Information Environment, and you notably you were a member of the Scientific Panel on Information Integrity about climate sciences. You worked for several months, I think 9 months, to get to the report that was published last week. And with you, would like to have this deep dive on what does research tells us about climate disinformation, because I think that we also need this sort of global assessment if we are to come up with appropriate answers. Frederic, the floor is yours.
Slides?
And I think we have slides again. There you go.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you so much for the organizers to, first of all, welcome us in Oslo. The IPIE is an entity that looks at the integrity of information environment across the board. So climate information environment is also one of those things that we look at. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a report that we compiled over a period of 12 months, looking at about 300 articles and using qualitative and computational methods, as well as quantitative methods to arrive at, which includes also data visualization. But I won't really dive into that for the case of time. I want to tell you about really what we found out. We used the linear model of communication by Harold Laswell, which really talks about, because what I'm gathering here in the panel today is there is a crisis in the information environment on climate change. There's clearly a crisis, and that crisis is what made us wonder. And as panelists, which was led by Jensen, Klaus Jensen from the University of Copenhagen, we realized that if you use the communication model, then we realized that there are people who produce those messages, the source, senders of the message, the initiators of the message, and then the channel and the messaging, and then the consequences of their messaging, and then, of course, after that, what then can we do about that kind of messaging? So if you look at that slide, we're talking about who the actors were, the messages and the channels that they used, their key audiences, and what the consequences of their messaging was, and what solutions we ought to have in that process. So 300 articles were looked at, and then after looking at those articles, we basically inspected the gaps and came up with recommendations. So the first culprits in terms of sources or actors in the datification of the information environment on climate change is actually fossil fuel companies, corporations. We have politicians. We do have governments, and also some states. We also have legacy and social media, and and scientific hands for hire. These are people who are hired to write something about climate change in favor of a particular position. And for example, if I just take a quick example, in countries like the US, in North America, we found out that the mainstream media still led in terms of spreading false information about climate. And this kind of information varied based on the type of media. If it was a conservative media or right-leaning media, you'd see the kind of messaging that come about in those kinds of platforms. And their messages were actually those that disputed the science about climate change. And this is where we find people like the US president, which we saw in the previous slide. So there we also realized that not much is known about the impact of what social media does in terms of the messaging in social media and how social media therefore impacts on audiences in ways that can be measured and analyzed to come up with countermeasures. And so that is one of the gaps that we saw. So this also has been touched around here because we do have a level where there's no transparency in digital platforms, especially on those the people who are the owners of the platforms and those who produce data in those platforms. And so eventually, the overall messaging that emerged is that strategic skepticism is actually replacing climate denialism. So people are strategically frustrating or obscuring climate science in order to delay the climate response, to cut into the chains of those in the policy line of coming up with measures that are supposed to address climate change and effectively derailing climate interventions. And again, we saw that classic media, of course, is leading in that arena. And I talked about how really it's still not clear on how social media is impacting directly on audiences. So if this is the scenario, then the kind of messages that we see, the message of obscurity, contrarianism, and the climatist cartelism is something that we see impacting on the information environment on climate change. And these are things that we need to address and deal with. So the key audiences that are supposed to be in the leading front, in the front lines of climate interventions, who are usually actually policymakers, are derailed and they are targeted. They are targeted by misinformation, and this misinformation also feeds into the policy chain and eventually affects climate intervention. So something needs to be done there. And therefore, effectively, generally, what this does, and panelists have mentioned this, is that it erodes public trust on climate science and also trust in institutions that are responsible for addressing climate change. So it has a dual effect. And if that happens, then it becomes challenging to address climate change going forward. So the IPIE, in our report, we came up with a few recommendations and about measures that we can take to address the crisis of information integrity on climate science. And one of those measures, some of them have been mentioned, is we need to educate people. We need some level of education, whether it's scientific on the science of climate change, or even the medium that transmits climate change. Because from the model that I began talking about, the linear communication model, we saw that media and channel go hand in hand. So if you educate audiences or stakeholders about the media that transmit climate change information and the science of climate change, then we might really go towards getting some level of success in climate intervention. We also have to look at the regulatory and the policy environment, you know? So regulation and legislation is something that is very key that we need to look at. For example, we need to come up with legislations that talk generally about how you need to talk about climate science if you are writing an article about it. What is the threshold? You know, that is legislation. There is a contentious area that you also found out in the data that is emerging on litigation, where minimal literature is talking about stakeholders and government and civil societies coming out and pointing out those people who are responsible for doing what is called greenwashing, you know, and whether, to what extent can you litigate on those issues? It's a gray area, it's a contentious area, and the data is still minimal. So that's one area that I think it's an opportunity to explore further in terms of research. And then I think I've touched them all. Yes, there's one that I didn't talk about, which is called counterpublics, you know? Counterpublics are simply, I think, I heard about it from my Brazilian colleague and from my UNESCO colleague here, about how we bring different voices from different spaces to form a coalition of counterpublics who are responsible to counter false discourses and misinformation from these powerful forces that are driving misinformation about climate change. So it's a coalition of collaboration about defending truth about climate science, and also scientists that are responsible for defending climate science and the integrity of information about climate science. I think I'll leave it there and explore more in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frederick. And please do take a look at the report. It's a rather longish report, 127 pages, I think. But there is a very streamlined executive summary that also brings the main conclusion and policy recommendations, which are very, very useful in this specific field. We still have a little bit more than half an hour, and we wanted to make sure that we also have an interactive section. We've been talking a lot about multi-stakeholderism. So if there are some questions in the room, I think there is already one person and then one there. So maybe we can take the two and the first two questions and have... Yes, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. My name is Pavel Antonov with Blue Link Action Network in Bulgaria and the APC board. This is seriously becoming my favorite panel since the morning when I heard the one on integrity of journalism. My network supports climate defenders in the Climate Coalition, and as a journalist, it's extremely interesting to listen to all the solutions you presented. What we have come across is that the climate defenders, as well as other activists around there, we seem to automatically sort of say they're the good guys, and we expect always automatically that the problems lie from the industry and from elsewhere, which is true in most cases. But what we realize is that there is a certain lack of norms, lack of standards that even the climate activists are coming to complain about at some point. They say the information environment has become so volatile, so fractured, we can't even operate healthily in it. So we thought, what if we come back to the norms of journalism as they used to be 20 years ago? The ones that were saying you need to double check your sources and offer the opposite point of view to your opponent, even if you disagree, and so on. And we offer this to the broader public, but to the climate defenders, to the civil society as a start, and see how they could abide with that same norms. Will they stop seeking for clicks? Will they stop communicated ungrounded information? Would they be willing to take this responsibility? I wanted to hear, what do you think about this? Do you think that might actually work as a self-regulatory approach? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Lee Kopp-Ottoman. I come from South Africa. I work for the Ministry of Basic Education. In the parts of the world where I come from, climate change is viewed as a white man's problem. It is viewed as a matter of whether it is cold or it is hot. But in actual fact, what we see is that it means loss of life, loss of property, loss of assets, and displacement. Now, what are the ethics in information sharing and information dissemination when it comes to climate change and climate action and education for sustainable development? Given that we don't want to incite fear, but we're working with a society that will not do anything unless it responds to a problem. And so you want to then create that picture that this is the problem that you're facing as the African continent and as the world. This is the problem. You're not inciting fear. Yet, when you find people who are really doing great work about teaching Africans like myself about the impact of climate change in our lives, you're always going to be seen as somebody who's inciting fear and anxiety on people. So what are the ethics? So what do we need to do? And how far can we go really to ensure that there is that balance of teaching people about this thing as being an issue of sustainability, but also an issue of safety?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Agenonga Robert. I come from Democratic Republic of Congo. I work at the border with DRC and Uganda. My submission or question is so much concerned with the information I have noted from different panelists. In the region where I come from, there is massive data collection going on for carbon credit project. Data being collected from indigenous territories, data from community forestry. My concern is not about who collect this data, but my worry is where are they keeping this data? What protocols are in place for them to store this data without harming indigenous people or forest-dependent community? Because in case this data get leaked or is compromised, it will have a very dangerous consequences on indigenous people and forest-dependent community, because I've seen it in Congo, where land is being stolen and forest given away to foreign investors to mine critical minerals needed to power AI and other things. So that is very painful. But also, when you look at the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on situation of environmental defenders under Aarhus Convention, Mr. Michel Faust, he noted recently that environmental activists and human rights defenders who work on issues of climate justice are not only targeted physically or through legal intimidation, but also they are surveilled and their data is spied by government. In Brazil, in Democratic Republic of Congo, and also in Indonesia, these are three major world forest basins where activists are at risk. And I don't know at UNESCO level, colleague from UNESCO, what international mechanisms are in place to ensure that members' countries abide by, so that data concerning forest, indigenous territories, or even security of defenders working on forest and climate justice is protected. Myself, I worked for 12 years as a digital security trainer, helping indigenous people in the Congo Basin to communicate and work safely. But beginning from January 2024, I became a member of parliament in the DRC National Assembly. But I see myself more as an activist who took himself to the parliament, because in government there is a lot of bureaucracy, and I continue with the activism, helping human rights defenders, environmental activists, and indigenous people to protect their land. But now we have the big threat is the project by Brazil, which is called the Tropical Forest Forever facility, my colleague from Brazil should be aware of this. This is a multi-billion project scheduled to be launched in Brazil at the COP, the next COP. This project, if developed, it means indigenous people or forest-dependent community can receive 4% of contribution being made from the sale of carbon credit generated from their forests. And for this to be quantified, data need to be collected on the carbon potential of forestry. And last month, we had a meeting of 3 forest world basins in Brazzaville in Congo, people from Indonesia, Brazil and Congo Basin and also Rwanda gathered in Brazzaville for a week. And the question here was data integrity. Who is using this data? How will a local chief know that his forest is the one providing global environmental benefit, yet he doesn't have the data? And what make Brazil and other partner government to only remit 4% of the total benefit arriving from carbon credit of arriving from climate benefit being provided by forest countries providing benefit of climate mitigation?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I like how we touched upon the vast majority, the vast topics, or the different topics that we can include in the concept of information integrity, so ranging from journalism and the ethics of journalism to data governance. So before turning and giving the floor to other questions, I don't know if some of you would like to react and answer some of the questions. Would like to go?
Sure.
Charlotte,
perhaps I could speak to the second question about fear, which I think is, I can't actually see the gentleman who asked. Yeah, there you go. Thank you for asking that question. It's an excellent one. And I can tell you it's one that as communicators on climate, we have been grappling with for a very long time. And what we have learned over a period of many years is that, yes, fear can be a motivator, but fear is not going to inspire people. And I think there are ways that one can communicate the urgency and gravity of the climate crisis without necessarily resorting to kind of scare tactics. People need to understand the situation that we're facing, right? I mean, there's no getting around it. But what they also need to know is what they can do about it, or what their government can do about it, what actions they can actually take. They need to see specific examples of especially community-led actions. I think that's what some people can really relate to. In terms of the impacts, I think they also need to understand, and myself is included in this, when I think about climate change, it becomes this overwhelming topic, right? You just want to shut down because you feel that you can't do anything about it on an individual level. And that's true, right? We need to look to the fossil fuel industry and governments and others to take action. But I think that there are steps that we can all take, including if we live in democracies, we can vote, right, for candidates who support climate action. But I think in terms of the impacts, it's also important to, as you alluded to actually, bring it back to what are some of the individual impacts, the economic impacts, but also the economic benefits of climate action, right? How does it affect people's wallet? How does it affect people's daily lives and their quality of life? So I think that, yes, it's important to stress the reality of the situation, and that might be scary, but equally it's important at the same time to offer really solid solutions and the way forward.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I don't know if Professor,
I would want to combine two questions.
Yeah.
One that was asked about journalism and going back to the tenets of journalism to address the climate change problematic, and also with that aspect of use of data and how sure are you that you're using the right data. Now, our report can help you understand some of those questions, because we asked ourselves in the report, what is really the measure or the threshold of information integrity about climate science? And we came up with a few issues that are familiar, things like accuracy, transparency, reliability of data, transparency, accuracy, and reliability of data, and how consistent that data is, because climate science data has also been inconsistent. If you say global warming is bringing about climate change, then tomorrow you are saying something else. You're becoming inconsistent. And that's the standard we see in climate misinformation. So for that, I think we also observed in the study that minimal studies have been done in the global south. In fact, we came out of 300 studies, we only uncovered one study from South Africa that touches on the metrics that we are measuring. So global south, minimal data, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, very minimal data. Most of the data was coming from North America, Europe, China, and Russia. So that tells us something about also our interest in wanting to venture into research, to produce homegrown data that can inform us. And to that extent, also comes the question of infrastructure. Because when you want to solve climate, when you want climate solutions out of data, then you also need to make that data secure. And therefore, the question of infrastructure comes in, where we lack data centers that are reliable, and if you have to have magnitude of data on data sets in climate science, then you need to host them elsewhere. And so how sure are you that that data will come and be beneficial to you as data that has some level of integrity? Yeah. So those are questions that can be answered, and that's why we are saying it's a multi-stakeholder approach, where so many actors need to put their heads together so that they find solutions to the climate challenge, but also from the understanding that the problem begins with data and those data sets.
Thank you so much. I think, Guillermo, you wanted to...
Very, very briefly, a few things. On the question on standards of journalism and ethics, etc., of course, this is very important. I don't know if you're here when I was speaking. It's not about one thing or the other. It's one thing and the other. So these standards, these self-regulatory elements are important and necessary, but they won't solve parts of the problem that are crucial to address the issue. For example, the transparency of the social media companies or the AI companies, or demanding them to have human rights-based content moderation and content curation mechanisms. So we just need to be careful to say that let's invest on this thing and forget the other, because it's not going to work. It's a complex puzzle, and unfortunately we need all the pieces of this puzzle. But on the standards, we also need to be careful that when we are talking about the standardized criteria for journalism of getting the other side, this is all fantastic. The best that can happen to climate discussion, it's not activism journalism, it's independent journalism. But independent journalism also means that you can't compare reports of the IPCC that shows with 99% of reliability that we have a problem and put this as if it was equal to the other 1% of people saying that we don't have an issue, right? I'm in favor that the journalists speak with the others, but also underlining to the reader or to the listener that there is an imbalance here that is not the same, right? So this is super important. On the question from the gentleman from South Africa, when you said this is perceived as a white man problem, this is precisely what we want with this initiative in stimulating more research and more investigative journalism from the Global South. Why this narrative is like that, and where this is coming from, what is the impact? Because what you are saying here, something I didn't know, it shows that it's different, the problem, in terms of information integrity, in where you are, probably is different in Brazil, is different in Indonesia, and so on. So this is super important in what we are trying to stimulate. And finally, on the data story, we are launching under the Broadband Commission with UNDP and others, a global toolkit on data governance, precisely addressing these kind of issues. And then on your last question in terms of violence and others against the journalists, etc., last year we dedicated the World Press Freedom Day entirely to this discussion. And then we can talk later, but we produced a roadmap talking with the journalists, the scientists, and how to address also this issue of attacks against those voices, those critical voices that are speaking about climate change or climate disinformation and other environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume. Maybe quick remarks from Aria to Eugenio, or could we go back? No? Yeah?
I wanted to make the link back as well to, I think mainly around the first question, but I wanted to give an example of the unhealthy incentives that are linked to some of these issues. So I wanted to take the idea of like quality of journalistic standards and how these are being impacted by the incentives we've talked about. So we did a piece of research about 5 years ago, and we looked at safe climate content online. So the most robust, entertaining, shared climate content online. And we found that actually something like 70% of that content couldn't monetize through advertising. So that means that there's no economic incentive to produce for reputable news organizations to produce that content. And it's why it's so important that we get advertisers around the table, because what they're doing is they're blocking climate content because they think it's too political or too risky for their brand to appear next to. So what this does is it completely disincentivizes the really great quality journalism around one of the most important issues of our time. We need to get them around the table and reinforce the idea. And we've got people that can make the business case that actually their advertising performs well. We also need to reinforce the idea that it's of the utmost importance that they actually go and advertise there, because we need better standards. It's also really important because then the third thing is that the platforms aren't incentivizing this content because it's not, because it doesn't necessarily keep people on the kind of platforms in the way that they want, because they're after eyeballs and attention and addiction, right? So it's really important that we then get the advertisers around the table with the platforms to go, actually, this is incredibly important for us, it's incredibly important for everyone in this room, and you need to do something about it. And we've seen that can create change. So Google introduced their first climate disinformation monetization policy because of that dynamic. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm not trying to answer all the questions. I would be happy to discuss some of the specific points that were raised. But talk to the African colleagues in the audience. I think we need more countries from the Global South to join this effort, because we have the global initiative on information integrity and climate change. Some countries have joined. I remember Chile, Denmark, France, Morocco, Sweden, United Kingdom. Several others also expressed interest in joining, but we need more developing countries as well. And everything that we need is political commitment. We don't ask anything else, but a political commitment to join forces to address climate change and information integrity as a package, as something that we should see this both ways, and how we can move forward in this regard.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for raising the point. And turn back to the question, if you could make them short so that we can have some time to respond. Thank you so much.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Mbali. I'm from UNHCR, based in Pretoria. And as you would know, UNHCR, we deal a lot with refugees and asylum seekers. And these are oftentimes groups of people that have very limited, reliable information, especially with climate risks. So in a country like Botswana, for example, where we have the encampment policy, how then do you think we can practically ensure that these groups of people are exposed to reliable information? Because in an encampment space, that I think is a place where misinformation can spread widely. So what are some of the practical ways that we can counter that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question.
Hi, my name is Larry Maggott. I'm CEO of Connect Safely, which is a Silicon Valley-based NGO that educates parents and young people about various aspects of internet online safety. And we partner very closely with Meta, Google, Apple, Amazon, and many of the technology companies in and around Silicon Valley. I'm also a former journalist with CBS News, New York Times, LA Times, and BBC, and still write a syndicated column and do a national radio show for CBS. And we work very closely with young people. And the one thing that seems to be, at least anecdotally, evident is that young people are very concerned about climate change. I will probably pass on before the world is in serious decay, but the young people are going to have to live with it and potentially die with it, which is tragic. And I'm trying to figure out, in our work, working on internet safety and and working with our Youth Advisory Council, how we can energize those young people and take advantage of their energy and their concern to channel some of their activities in ways that will actually have an impact on decision makers, policy makers, industry, and government.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Mikko Salo. I'm representing a Finnish NGO, Faktabar, who has been working on the fact-checking and mostly on the digital information literacy, and especially on AI literacy. But very much on a follow-up of the previous person, one of the most promising things that we did was we were fact-checking Greta Thunberg at the time. And as we know, she was she has addressed both of the issues very closely. And she was mostly right on everything, but of course became a huge campaigns, very polarizing and all that. But I was wondering, what have you learned about the Greta Thunberg case? Because she was really empowering the youngsters, and perhaps the COVID killed the movement in the moment, because young people were really doing something, because now they are becoming vegetables with the technology, addicted to that one. But that was something very promising. But I wonder, has there been the kind of what could be done different? Because there is something right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, last question very quickly, please.
Hi, this is Jasmine Ko from Hong Kong. So last year, I was the National Youth Representative of ALCOI, the Regional Conference of Youth, endorsed by UN Yangon on climate change. So one thing that I found it's a reflection for me in the conference when we are drafting youth statement for the region. We have not considered and thought about information integrity as a problem on climate change when we are drafting the agenda and things. So for me, my reflection and also a question is, how could we possibly bring this topic into youth statement? Because the thing is, our region, the thing that they did not consider it problematic enough is because there are a lot of corporate greenwashing and solution provided. And the thing is, this kind of information has been overflowing, and then people believe that the problem have been tackled very well. That's why it's never on the agenda and the youth statement. So it's just my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these brilliant questions on the place of young people in these debates and on how to make sure that reliable information is accessible to all the different communities. There is very quickly one question online that is addressed directly to Professor Ogenga and I will try to sum it up, but basically it argues that if we have such a lack of data, how can we build actual policies? And probably in the global majority world, how can we make sure that with the lack of data, we can build factual and actual policies? So we still have 8 minutes and 5 speakers, so maybe we can do a quick roundup. And if you'd like to address, I really like the question related to the youth, access to reliable information and policy development. Who wants to go first?
I can start very quickly.
Guilherme.
So, I mean, on the question of refugees and migration, etc., I think the colleagues but you can add, I guess, Charlotte, in the UNHCR in Geneva, they are doing lots of interesting things on that. But there are interesting lessons learned from the past, using radio in refugee camps to debunk these and to stimulate information sharing, etc. But the essential issue here that I think it's very important with this question is that we need to put a lot of focus on groups that are in situation of vulnerability and marginalization, whoever they are. So the issues of multilingualism, of the special protections that are needed are super important in this conversation. Regarding the several questions on youth and Greta, for those who don't know, I would strongly recommend for you to look into the Guardian project that's called the 89% Project. which basically is very solid research saying that 89% of the people in this planet do believe that we have a climate problem. The question is why they are not taking action. And some of our hypotheses are related to how the disinformation is shifting. It's not any longer about saying there isn't a problem. It's much more sophisticated than that. But we do need to understand the characteristics of this disinformation to then sophisticate our own actions on that. And then it comes to the last point I wanted to comment, stealing a bit the thunder regarding what the panel has produced on the data issue, no? The lack of evidence to produce evidence-based policy. So I do this call for action to you. Apply to the global initiative, because this is precisely what we want to see. We want to see more data being produced, more information being produced, so that we can circulate more information to produce evidence-based policy. And of course, for the donors in the room or online, contribute to the fund, because then we can fund more research and data production.
And I think we can thank Brazil for putting the first million in the fund, which is very, very crucial, specifically in the funding landscape that we all operate in. So we'll still have 5 minutes.
Yeah, just because I want to speak to the excellent question about offline engagement, and I think just to build on what Guillermo was saying about vulnerable and marginalized groups, when we started out on the process of coming up with the global principles, we initially were just going to focus on the digital space, but quickly realized through the course of our global consultations that actually we needed to take a much broader approach because, of course, as we all know, there are many people who have inadequate connectivity or no connectivity at all, who aren't in a position to engage digitally, who are still impacted by the disinformation and hate that's spread online. But I think, one of the things I touched on in my remarks was what we term community engagement. And this also is really valid, not just in terms of the UN's work on refugees, but our work in peacekeeping environments and all over the world, that we have to be in communities listening to people. That has to happen face to face. And one thing that's important for us all to remember is that we talk about news, we talk about major influencers, we talk about digital. Most people are most influenced by the people they know. They're influenced by their pastor or priest, by their teacher, by their local community leader, by their uncle, by their cousin. And that is how we can effectively reach people, by identifying those local community voices who are trusted, local community leaders, and sharing reliable information with them so that they can then amplify in a way that's going to be engaging. So I would say that's a really important point about offline. And then just on youth, I would say, and I'm not a youth anymore, sadly, but we need to engage with youth in a meaningful way by actually listening to them on an equal footing, bring them to the table, right? Not being an add-on to a process, but having them integrated from the start, because there's a lot we can learn from them. They're digital natives and we're not.
Absolutely. Totally agree on the last point. Eugenio.
Real quick, my final remarks. I fully agree with the need to engage young people. And we have this call to action that we expect individuals, organizations to submit concrete proposals on information integrity and climate change. I think we need to build momentum because COP30 is going to be the culmination of these global efforts. And we're also planning to have a high-level side events in Belém to showcase these initiatives. And of course, this is an open invitation to you all, the audience here, also people online, to stay tuned because this call to action will be released soon. And we are glad to see that many stakeholders have already expressed interest in sending proposals, and will be, of course, available for any follow-up as needed.
Thank you so much for opening the doors of COP30 also to this community working on information integrity. It's really, really important.
I felt like if I go without responding to that question from, I think it's an online audience, who asked about where there's lack of data in the global south, then what do we do? Well, this is a challenge that emerges from a trajectory of orality, because Africans are oral by nature, but it doesn't mean that they are not climate experts. And for example, the Ogiek community in Kenya a community that is known for preserving forests. So the capitalistic way of looking at climate interventions really disregards their local wisdom on how to address the climate challenge using carbon credit programs that are more from global multinationals as opposed to grassroots approaches. So my suggestion would be, what are the grassroots approaches that we can find, through primary research? So as opposed to what we did, because we did a systematic review. That is not going to the field and engaging with the locality, so that you can dive into the local knowledge repository to get data that then can inform a practical, more meaningful practical interventions. And therefore, after you do that, you simply monitor and evaluate, iterate, and develop literature about it, so that it can guide your interventions going forward. Largely, that is what is lacking. So my suggestion would be that we need to look into ways in which we can partner with those who are capable of making us be in a position where we can co-create together, and then be able to use locally available resources and infrastructures to come up with data that can bring, for example, greening. Just planting trees is not rocket science. But how many are we that are doing tree planting, or maybe fruit tree planting at the grassroots level? We take it for granted. So it's time we stop taking those things for granted, we document them, and we see how those things can help us in finding our own knowledge and data about where we want to move forward with the problem of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Harriet, one last...
I will be very quick, and I'll answer the point about young people. So I talk about these issues quite a lot. And the last time I talked about these issues, I was on stage after a young woman called Adele Zeynep Walton, who has just written a book. And she wrote this book because her younger sister unfortunately took her own life after being served content online through exactly the kind of patterns that I've described that encouraged her to do so. And there is a crisis in the mental health of young people, and that is exacerbated by what is happening to them online. And I got very cross yesterday after a panel, I won't lie, because someone said we need to wait for regulation around this, and we absolutely do. We need regulation of this space, but people are getting hurt in the interim, and we need to do everything we can to move very quickly to solve these problems. And that includes helping our young people to feel hopeful about the future, releasing them from the systems that are addicting them, and pulling them online and helping them to despair. So I just leave you with that. We solve everything we talked about today, and we will also go some way to looking at the mental health crisis in young people today.
Thank you so much for these last remarks. There is a word that comes, and Eugenio mentioned, mutirao. I hope I'm pronouncing it all right. And really, I would like to take this word because information integrity, as you may have understood today, is a big house, and everybody is welcome to bring their own contribution to build that and make sure that we have access to reliable information, that we protect our youth, that we protect access to facts, journalists, activists from around the world. And really, I think that with this global initiative, with the fund, with the call to action, we have a very precious thing that will take forward and that will bring to COP, and hopefully beyond COP30. That will be, of course, crucial. Thank you so much for being with us today, and of course, we remain available. Thank you.